Good morning, everyone. It's Reverend Mike Caper from the First Presbyterian Church of Elmwood Park. We're doing our second sermon on the spirituality of conflict. You may remember that last week we talked about the campaign to end slavery in the British Empire from, say, 1780 to 1840. And one of the themes we explored was the theme of imagination, that the challenge was to get the public to imagine what it was like to be a slave. And I wanted to explore this theme of imagination and slavery somewhat further this week using some text from the book of Exodus. I'm going to just give some vignettes from Exodus and comment on the imagination at play and some of the historical events. And it's really interesting to see how universal many of these concepts and principles are. Let me just dive right in. I'm going to read from Exodus chapter 1, starting at verse 6. There's going to be this mention of Joseph. Joseph is one of the patriarchs from the book of Genesis, who goes to Egypt and eventually becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man and saves the country from a famine. And he was, held in very high regard. And now what we're going to learn is that the situation for the Hebrews in Egypt has changed. So verse 6. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land of Egypt was filled with them. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing. Note the lack of historical imagination. He came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them. Cue the villain laugh there. Or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. So I just want to call this fearful imagination. This new king, this new Pharaoh comes to power, and he points at something that could theoretically become a threat and uses it to make the people afraid and causes them to do this evil thing of enslaving the Israelites. And you will notice that the thing that they do is also to their economic benefit because they now have a free labor source to build some cities and monuments. And this is a common tactic used by political leaders throughout history. You name somebody as a threat and you say, give me power and I will handle this threat for you and keep you safe. And we will oppress the outsiders together, the ones that we're afraid of, but now we're going to oppress them so we can control them so everything stays to our advantage. Sad, but common. All right, then in verse 12, I call this doubling down on their evil imaginings. The more they were oppressed, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. So they're more afraid, and so they oppress them harder. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all the kinds of work in the fields. And in all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. And then, because you can't stop once you've started down this road, you can't say, this is an unsolvable problem. You can't back up if you're a politician. Pharaoh introduces a new idea. Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, so they drown to death, but let every girl live. He comes up with an idea for genocide. Now, this is dark stuff, the book of Exodus, but here's a nice spot. In chapter 2, Moses' mother becomes pregnant and she hides the baby for 3 months. She manages to have him not thrown into the Nile and drowned. And it says that when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Moses' sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. When Pharaoh's daughter saw the baby, he was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister, Moses' sister, came up and helpfully asked, "Shall I go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," said Pharaoh's daughter. And so the sister goes to find Moses' mother to engage her as the wet nurse so Pharaoh's daughter can have this baby around. And what I love about this passage, first of all, is the subversion of the cruel rules. In a sense, they did throw Moses into the Nile, but they did it in a basket so he won't drown. And the belief that even the Egyptians had a heart. So Pharaoh's daughter, does have a heart, and she does save this child. And Moses will grow up to become the great leader that we'll talk about. He doesn't start that way, however. I'm going to be reading now from Exodus 2:11-15. This is where Moses is making some assumption that it's us and them. It's Israelites and Egyptians, and he doesn't muddle them. So he goes out to where his own people were, and he watched them at their hard labor. And so he gets a sense of what's going on here. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" And then Pharaoh heard about this and tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. So it's never totally simple, right? It's not like there's good guys wearing white hats and bad guys wearing black hats. Even the oppressed group has people who do evil and sinful things, and even the oppressor remain human beings and have the potential to do good. I'm going to read from chapter 3. This is the famous scene where Moses sees God in the form of a burning bush. And this is where God is interjected into the story, and I call this including God in your imagination. The angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in flames of fire from within a bush. When Moses saw that the bush was on fire but did not burn up, and then when the Lord saw that he had come over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses!" And Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy ground." And then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. That was dangerous. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land flowing with milk and honey." And so God intercedes in this situation. And this is something the Egyptians haven't been thinking about, and it should terrify them, although it doesn't for a long time. And whether the Israelites had any faith that God was going to do anything or not, I don't know. But they were crying out to God. God heard, and God is going to act. But it's difficult for us to imagine we can do something, even if we feel like God is on our side, right? So here's a little further in that same chapter, verses 10 to 14. God says, "Go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go talk to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, "I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." And Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' What shall I tell them?" Then God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites: 'I am has sent you.'" And there's some further dialogue there. Moses complains about not being able to speak very well. Some people think he actually may have been a stutterer. God says, "Well, take your brother Aaron. He speaks well." And so Moses gets a companion. And there are going to be a lot of people who support him on this. It's an important part of the story that we're not really going to go into deeply. But there's an interesting thing that happens next, starting, this is chapter 3, verse 20 to 22, about the condition of the slaves when they are freed. "I will stretch out my hand," says God, "and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them." We're going to call those the plagues later in the book. "And after that, Pharaoh will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward this people, the Israelites, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians." So last week we heard about the British slaves being set free with nothing. God has a plan that there will be some prosperity for people when they achieve freedom in Exodus. Now, initially, the Egyptians don't take to this plan very well, as you might imagine. There's always resistance to big change, especially when it involves fear and it involves greed, as we already said. But here's a few verses from chapter 5, starting at verse 10. Pharaoh is again going to double down on the exploitation. "Then the slave drivers and the overseers went out and said to the people, 'Here's what Pharaoh says: I will not give you any more straw.'" Turns out you need straw to make bricks, I think to bind the clay together. Anyways, "Go and get your own straw wherever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced at all." So the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use for straw, and the slave drivers just kept pressing them, saying, "Complete the work required of you each day, just as when you were supplied with straw." And Pharaoh's slave drivers, listen to that, Pharaoh's slave drivers beat the Israelite overseers, first time we've heard of that group, that they had appointed, demanding, "Why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday or today as before?" You know, this is exploitation, free and clear. You give people less resources, expect the same output. And of course, the danger in a situation like this is that the Israelites who have some level of power, the overseers, will buy into the exploiter's narrative. So, here's what happens starting in verse 15. "The Israelite overseers went and appealed to Pharaoh. 'Why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, and yet we are told, make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people, the Egyptians.' Pharaoh said," get this, "lazy, that's what you are, lazy. Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, and yet you must produce your full quota of bricks." So Pharaoh takes the exploitation that he's committing on the Israelites and uses words to imply that it's their own fault. They're lazy. That has also been done many times in history, and you will hear it even today. The Israelite overseers realized that they were in trouble, and when they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them. And they said, "May the Lord look on you and judge you." This is your fault. I added that part. "But you have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh," that's from the Bible, "and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." So the collaborators, the Israelite overseers, who are better off than the lower level Israelite slaves, are upset with Moses and Aaron for having the imagination to try and change the situation. And by extension, they're angry at God because Moses is carrying out God's plan, but they use religious language to condemn Moses and Aaron. May the Lord look on you and judge you. Another tool of exploitation is to use religious language to help exploit and keep people down. And that is a sad but true historical fact also. And, whenever the exploiters or the oppressors, kind of fight back with new tactics, there's some fragmentation that occurs among the exploited group about maybe this is worse, maybe we should go back to the way it was, maybe we don't want to see this through. And that's a moment of crisis for any movement. So that's all I'm going to say about the situation when the Israelites are slaves in Egypt. There's a lot more. The book of Exodus is fascinating. There are the famous plagues that come, including the plague of the firstborn, and finally Pharaoh lets the people go, and then he changes his mind and sends the army after him, and Moses parts the Red Sea, and all the people cross safely to the other side. The army enters the sea after them, splash, and all Pharaoh's army drowns. And then they go to the mountain where Moses met God, and God begins to give them the law of the Lord to live by. And what I think we would hope as 21st century people is that there would be no more slaves. But we have to confront the harsh truth that in the Bible, slavery is there and seems to be tolerated. I'm going to read a little bit from Exodus 21. I titled this section, "Ex-Slaves Keeping Slaves." All right. "These are the laws you are to set before the people. If you buy a Hebrew servant," note that the word in the Bible for servant and slave is usually the same word, "he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free, but if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. But if his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons and daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man will go free." Now, speaking a little more of women, I'm going to skip down to verse 7. "If a man sells his daughter as a servant," note that they can do that, "she is not to go free as male servants/slaves do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed." I think that means bought back. "He has no right to sell her to foreigners," that's good, because he's broken faith with her. "If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter." Good. "If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these things, she is to go free without any payment of money." So, there it is. Exodus 21, rules for slavery given by God to the people. This leads us to a most uncomfortable question. And I need to pull up, oh boy, I thought I had this handy. All right, I'm not going to be able to quote Nick, but there's a guy named Nick who asked this great question on the sermon I posted last week about why doesn't God condemn slavery at this time? And that is just an awesome question, because wouldn't things be better if God had condemned it clearly, and way back then, right? Maybe we wouldn't have had slavery all this time. I love that question. So I don't know if I have any good answers, but here's some of the options one might theoretically think of. Maybe God is okay with slavery. I don't like that one, but it was a very popular answer for slave owners in the 18th, 19th centuries. They took the text of the Bible and they said God is okay with slavery and we're keeping slaves and that's what we're going to do. There you go. All right. Another answer might be that God somehow lacked the imagination to imagine a world without slavery. I'm not going to say much more about that because I don't buy that one, but I suppose it's somehow theoretically possible, but I really don't think so. But I'm trying to list possibilities here. More likely, the people couldn't imagine a world without slavery, and God accommodated them by laying out some rules that improve the situation. This word accommodation is a good Reformed theological principle that God speaks to us in ways that we can understand and not in ways that we can't. So God, the infinite God, accommodates God's self to we mortal finite people with a limited perspective. The rules that are laid out in Exodus 21 may be something of an improvement over the terrible situation in Egypt and the sort of universal situation of slaves around the known world at that time. That's probably my favorite answer, but I don't really like any of them that much. And, the final answer, of course, is I don't know. There is a whole category of question about why God didn't do things differently. And fundamentally, those questions probably don't have any good answers. I mean, why, for example, didn't God help us invent the vaccine against smallpox 500 years earlier, or make our bodies immune to cancer? Or why isn't the world somehow fundamentally different than it is? And there's a lot of things that are, unfortunately remain a mystery to us. And it's a question that is worth grappling with and that should enter into our current ethical thought as we use the Bible as a source of ethics. Why is it that certain things, particularly the treatment of women and the treatment of slaves, were not forbidden in stronger terms? I don't know. But I can tell you what God actually did that's notable. Even in the Old Testament, God's repeated, continual focus is on the poor, the needy, and the exploited. God cares about the slaves in Egypt. The prophets constantly berate people with power against judging unfairly for the wealthy and the privileged. The widow and the orphan are listed as topics of concern. Almost the primary measure of a society is how it treats widows and orphans. That's an ongoing theme. The second thing is that God sent Jesus, who institutes a new kind of moral imagination. There's a definite ethical progression. On the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says things like, "You have heard it said in the past, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth." That's quoting that same law of Moses from Exodus and the other books of the Pentateuch. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So there's a demonstration of a moral progress that is instantiated with Jesus. Seems to be an arc of God healing the world. And Jesus is at a further point on that arc than Moses was. And we, I hope, are at a further point than the people of Jesus' time were. And the next thing to say is what I mentioned last week. In Galatians 3, the early church becomes an institution where people of radically different classes and categories mix. So there are rich and poor, slave and free, men and women, Jew and Gentile. They're all part of the body of Christ. They're all to be respected as children of God. Love your neighbor as yourself applies to all those categories. They didn't abolish slavery, but slaves are, in a sense, an equal in the church, which mirrors, by the way, the African American experience in the United States, where black churches became a place of dignity, where people could exercise leadership. And the last thing I'm going to say, in Jesus, God becomes a slave. Philippians 2 goes like this. If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, any comfort from his love, any common sharing of the Spirit, any tenderness or compassion, make my joy complete, writes Paul, by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and in one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. Hard to have slaves when you're doing that. Looking not to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a slave. And being in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That's it for this week, my friends. I'll try and put these biblical texts in the comments, and wish you God bless. Thanks to Nick for his help.